There is a precise moment when fear is still present, but something inside you no longer collapses under it. Your heart may be racing. Your thoughts may still be warning you. Yet strangely, you are here, aware, watching. For a second, fear doesn't disappear, but it loses command. Most people experience this briefly by accident and then assume it meant nothing. They go back to fighting fear, escaping it, or trying to silence it. But that moment was not random. It was a signal. A glimpse of what happens when consciousness becomes stronger than fear. The real question isn't how to remove fear from your life. It's why, in that moment, fear stopped being the center, and how that shift is possible again, this time not by chance. Most people never notice the moment they hand power to fear. It doesn't happen during panic. It happens earlier, quietly, almost politely. It's the moment you interpret fear as a message about reality rather than a pattern about yourself. That single confusion is the silent mistake. And once it happens, fear feels bigger, heavier, more authoritative than it actually is. From an early age, you were trained to read fear as a warning sign. Heart racing meant danger. Tension meant something was wrong. Hesitation meant you should stop. This logic made sense when threats were physical and immediate, but the nervous system never updated its software. Today, the same internal signals are triggered by emails, conversations, decisions, memories, and imagined futures. The body reacts as if something external is happening now, even when the trigger is internal and repetitive. Here is the part almost no one questions. Fear is often not reacting to what is in front of you, but to what has been rehearsed inside you. A familiar scenario, a known discomfort, a loop the brain recognizes and can predict. When that loop starts, fear shows up not because something is objectively dangerous, but because something is familiar, and familiarity feels safer to the nervous system than the unknown, even when that familiarity is painful. The mistake is assuming intensity equals importance. Fear feels intense, so you assume it must be telling the truth. But intensity is not accuracy, it's just energy, and energy follows repetition. The more a certain reaction has been practiced, the faster and louder it appears. Over time, the brain becomes efficient at producing fear, not because it's needed, but because it's habitual. Notice how often fear sounds urgent, but vague. It rarely says something precise. It says, this is bad, this won't work, and you're not ready, without providing new data. That's a clue. When information is missing but emotion is strong, you're usually dealing with habit, not insight. Yet most people treat that signal as if it were a live report from reality, instead of an echo from the past. Another layer of the mistake is personalization. Fear arises, and instantly the thought appears, this is me, my weakness, my limit, my truth. But fear is not a character trait, it's a state, and states pass unless you reinforce them by believing they define you. The moment you say, I'm afraid, and silently add, therefore this means something about who I am or what will happen, fear gains weight. It moves from sensation to identity. There's also an energy leak hidden here. When you argue with fear, suppress it or obey it automatically. You feed it attention. Attention is fuel, not because fear is powerful, but because whatever is attended to becomes central. The brain assumes what you focus on must matter. So fear keeps being promoted internally, not because it's right, but because it's highlighted. Pause for a second and recall a recent moment of fear, not the story around it, just the raw sensation, tightness, heat, pressure. Now notice how quickly the mind rushed to explain it, justify it or escape it. That reflexive explanation is the habit, and habits feel convincing precisely because they are familiar. The paradox is this: fear feels stronger when it is unquestioned, not when it is intense. The moment you start to see fear as a repeated internal event rather than a reliable external signal, something loosens. Not because fear disappears, but because its authority weakens. It no longer speaks as the voice of reality. It speaks as a voice within reality. And this is where things begin to shift. because once fear is seen as habit, not truth, a different possibility opens. If it was learned, it can be unlearned. If it is automatic, it can be observed. And observation changes the relationship entirely. The next time fear appears, the question subtly changes from what is wrong to something quieter, something more destabilizing to fear itself. Is this reaction running me, or am I aware of it running? That question doesn't remove fear. It prepares the ground for something else to emerge. When fear appears, it feels like a thought, a sentence, a warning you can almost hear. But by the time language shows up, the decision has already been made somewhere much deeper. This is what confuses so many people. They believe fear is born in thinking, when in reality, thinking is late to the event. Before you understand that you are afraid, your brain has already classified the situation, not with words, but with pattern recognition. A fraction of a second is enough. Sensory information arrives, and instead of being calmly analyzed by logic first, it takes a shortcut. It passes through emotional circuits designed for speed, not accuracy. Their job is simple: predict, not explain. This is why fear feels automatic. Because it is. The amygdala, a small structure often mentioned but rarely understood, is not a fear generator. It is a relevance detector. It constantly asks one question: have I seen something like this before, and did it matter? If the answer is even vaguely yes, it sends a signal to mobilize the body. Heart rate changes, muscles prepare, attention narrows. All of this happens before you have a chance to agree or disagree. Then the mind steps in and tells a story. You experience this as overthinking, but the thinking is actually a post-event narrator. Logic arrives after the emotional brain has already pulled the lever. And because humans dislike uncertainty, the mind rushes to justify what the body is already doing. Fear tightens the chest, and thought says, something must be wrong. The sensation came first. The explanation came later. This is why arguing with fear so often fails. You're trying to negotiate with the narrator, while the stage crew has already rearranged the entire set. The lights are dimmed, the music is tense, and now the mind is expected to feel calm inside a scene designed for threat. It's an unfair request. Another important detail is prediction. The brain is not primarily reactive, it is predictive. It constantly guesses what will happen next based on past data. Fear is often not a response to the present moment, but to an anticipated one. A meeting hasn't happened yet, but the body is already preparing. A conversation hasn't occurred, but the nervous system is bracing. In these moments, fear is not about what is real, but about what is probable, according to old memory. This is where repetition matters more than truth. If a certain outcome has been imagined many times, the brain treats it as familiar, and familiar does not mean pleasant, it means known. The nervous system prefers known discomfort over unknown possibility, so it reacts strongly not because danger is high, but because predictability is being threatened. Notice how fear often spikes when you are about to do something new, even something positive. The brain cannot rely on previous maps, so it increases alert signals. This isn't sabotage. It's a system trying to maintain coherence with past experience. From the brain's perspective, the unknown is information missing, and missing information feels risky. Now here is the subtle trap. Once fear activates the body, the narrowed attention makes it harder to access broader awareness. You lose peripheral vision, mentally and emotionally. Everything seems more serious, more personal, more final. This is not wisdom, it's physiology. But in that state, the mind believes its own urgency. Pause for a moment and recall a recent fear response. Notice how fast it was, how little choice you felt you had. That lack of choice is the key signal that you are inside an automatic loop, not a conscious one. And most people live there so often that they assume it's just how life feels. But something interesting happens when you stop trying to correct the fear and instead start noticing the sequence. Sensation first, story second, identity last. That noticing doesn't shut down the emotional brain, but it brings another region online, the one capable of observing without immediately reacting. This changes the timing. And timing changes everything, because once you see that fear is an early signal, not a final verdict, you stop treating it as an order. It becomes data. Strong data, yes, but incomplete. And incomplete data does not deserve full authority. The problem is that many people, upon learning this, try to override fear with optimism, or force calm onto a system that is still activated. That effort often backfires, for reasons that become clear when you understand how the brain interprets suppression. And that's where the next misunderstanding quietly takes shape. At some point, almost everyone receives the same advice. Think positively. Replace the negative thought. Focus on what's good. Reframe the situation. On the surface, this sounds reasonable. If fear creates suffering, then positivity should dissolve it. But for many people, the opposite happens. The more they try to be positive, the more anxious, tense, or disconnected they feel. And they often blame themselves for that reaction, assuming they are doing it wrong. What's actually happening is far more mechanical than personal. When fear activates the nervous system, the body enters a state of heightened vigilance. Muscles tighten. Breathing changes. Attention narrows. In this state, the brain is not looking for inspiring narratives, it is scanning for threat. When you suddenly introduce forced positivity into that system, the brain doesn't interpret it as help. It interprets it as inconsistency. From the brain's perspective, something doesn't add up. The body feels alert, guarded, and prepared. But the mind is being instructed to say, everything is fine. That mismatch is not calming, it's confusing. And confusion, to a nervous system, often signals greater risk. If things were truly safe, why would reassurance be necessary? This is why repeating positive affirmations while feeling afraid can increase internal tension. One part of the system is shouting danger, while another is trying to silence it with optimistic language. The brain resolves this conflict not by relaxing, but by amplifying the signal that seems more urgent. And urgency always wins over reassurance. There's another layer that makes this worse. When you try to replace fear with positivity, you're implicitly telling your brain that fear is unacceptable, something to be eliminated, something that shouldn't be there. But suppression is not neutral. When an internal signal is rejected, the brain often assumes it carries critical information, so it increases the volume. Think of it like ignoring a warning light on a dashboard while continuing to drive. The system doesn't calm down because you're smiling. It escalates because it's not being acknowledged. This doesn't mean positivity is useless, it means timing matters. Positivity works when the nervous system is regulated enough to receive it. But when fear is active, what the brain needs first is validation, not contradiction. Not agreement with the story of fear, but recognition of the signal itself. Notice how different it feels to say, I shouldn't feel this way, versus, this is what my system is doing right now. The first adds resistance, the second adds space, and space is what allows the system to begin settling. There's also an identity trap hidden in forced positivity. When you try to maintain a positive mindset at all costs, fear becomes evidence of failure. If I were stronger, more evolved, more conscious, I wouldn't feel this. That belief doesn't reduce fear, it adds shame. And shame is a powerful amplifier of anxiety because it turns a temporary state into a judgment about the self. Underneath all of this is a misunderstanding of control. Many people believe that changing thoughts directly changes emotional states. But emotions don't take orders from language. They respond to safety cues, tone, pace, attention. When you rush to be positive, you often move faster than the body can follow. And that speed alone keeps the system activated. Pause and recall a moment when someone told you to calm down while you were already tense. The words themselves may have been kind, but the effect was the opposite. Not because the advice was wrong, but because it bypassed the state you were in. This is the same thing you do to yourself when you force positivity. You skip over the actual experience and try to install a better one on top of it. The brain resists because it hasn't been met where it is. Interestingly, the nervous system calms not when fear disappears, but when it is allowed without urgency. When fear is noticed without being fixed, something changes in the background. the body receives a subtle message. This can be felt without immediate action. That message is far more regulating than any positive statement, and this is where the shift begins to reveal itself. Not when fear is replaced, but when it is accompanied. When you realize you can feel fear and remain present, intact and responsive, that realization doesn't erase fear, but it changes your position in relation to it. And that position is the first real signal that something in you is no longer completely identified with the reaction itself. Most people assume growth becomes obvious when fear disappears. They expect a clean internal silence, confidence without friction, a sense of certainty that replaces doubt. So when fear still shows up, they conclude nothing has changed. But this expectation is backwards. The first real sign that your consciousness is becoming stronger is not the absence of fear. It is the presence of awareness inside it. There is a moment, often brief and easy to miss, when fear arises and something does not collapse with it. The body reacts. The familiar sensations appear. The mind begins to form its usual interpretations. And yet underneath all of that, there is a subtle stability. You notice what is happening instead of being fully absorbed by it. Fear is there, but it is no longer the only thing there. At first, this can feel disappointing. You might think, if I were truly more conscious, I wouldn't feel this at all. But that thought itself belongs to the old framework, where progress is measured by emotional elimination. Consciousness doesn't work that way. It doesn't erase experiences, it holds them. The nervous system can be activated while awareness remains spacious. This coexistence is the shift, and because it's unfamiliar, many people overlook it. They're so focused on whether fear is present that they miss the fact that something new is present alongside it. Notice the difference between being afraid and knowing you are afraid. When fear runs the system, there is no distance. The sensation, the story, and the identity merge into one. This is happening. It's bad. And it's me. But when consciousness strengthens, a small gap appears. Not a cold detachment, but a clear seeing. Fear is felt, yet it is also seen. This seeing is not intellectual. It's experiential. You don't think, I am observing fear. You simply realize you're still here while fear moves through you. Breathing continues. Perception remains. You are not erased by the reaction. That realization carries a quiet power, even if it doesn't feel dramatic. At this stage, fear may even feel more noticeable. Not because it has increased, but because you are no longer fully inside it. When awareness expands, contrast becomes sharper. You feel the tightness more clearly, the thoughts more distinctly. This can be mistaken for regression, but it's actually sensitivity returning. There's also a change in timing. Before, fear would appear, and behavior would follow almost instantly. Now there is a pause. It might be half a second. It might be just enough to notice an impulse without acting on it. That pause is not hesitation. It's choice beginning to re-enter the system. Importantly, this doesn't mean you suddenly make perfect decisions. You may still react, you may still avoid, but afterward, you recognize what happened without drowning in self-judgment. The narrative softens. Instead of, I always do this, there is, that was fear. This shift in language reflects a shift in identity. Fear is no longer fused with who you are. Another subtle sign is that you stop trying to fix the experience immediately. You don't rush to calm down. You don't scramble for explanations or reassurance. There's a willingness to let the moment be uncomfortable without treating discomfort as an emergency. This tolerance is not indifference, it's capacity, and capacity changes everything. When the system learns that fear can be present without catastrophe, it begins to reorganize, not through force, but through exposure without overwhelm. This is how resilience is built, not by conquering fear, but by discovering you can stay present with it. You may notice that fear still speaks, but its tone changes. It sounds less like a command and more like a suggestion, less absolute, less convincing. And sometimes in the middle of fear, a simple realization appears. This is a reaction, not as a defense, but as a fact. That fact doesn't end fear. It changes your relationship to it. And once relationship changes, control shifts. Not in the sense of domination, but in orientation. You are no longer positioned inside the reaction. You are positioned with it. From here, something else becomes possible. If awareness can exist alongside fear, then attention can move in new ways. You begin to notice not just the reaction, but how you relate to it. And that distinction opens the door to a deeper difference, one between reacting automatically and observing consciously, even while the body is still learning how to catch up. At first glance, reacting and observing can look almost identical from the outside. The same fear arises, the same tension appears in the body, the same thoughts rush in. But internally, these two states are radically different, even though the difference is subtle enough that most people never learn to recognize it. When you are reacting, the experience is immersive. There is no separation between what is happening and who you believe you are in that moment. The sensation in the body, the emotional charge and the interpretation in the mind collapse into a single stream. Action follows almost automatically. A word is spoken, a decision is made, an opportunity is avoided, and afterward, it often feels like it all happened too fast to choose differently. Observation, on the other hand, does not remove the reaction. It changes the position from which the reaction is experienced. Fear can still be strong. Thoughts can still be persuasive. But they are no longer the only reference point. Something else is present, a quiet awareness that notices the reaction as it unfolds. This awareness is not distant or analytical. It doesn't comment or judge, it simply registers. Tightness is felt as tightness. Thoughts are heard as thoughts. Urges are sensed as urges. And because they are noticed, they are no longer fused with identity in the same way. The reaction is happening, but it is not happening as you. The key difference lies in momentum. Reacting has no pause. Observing introduces a slight interruption in the flow, not enough to stop the reaction entirely, especially at first, but enough to slow it. That slowing is critical. It allows the nervous system to receive a new signal. Not everything that arises must be executed. From a neurological perspective, this is not abstract. When you observe instead of react, different networks in the brain become active. Circuits related to self-regulation and context come online, while the threat-driven loops lose some dominance. This doesn't happen because you force it, but because attention has shifted from content to process. Most people try to observe by thinking about what is happening. That usually fails. Observation is not commentary, it's presence. The moment you start explaining the reaction, you are back inside the story. True observing feels simpler, almost bodily. A sense of this is occurring without the need to fix or resolve it immediately. You can feel this difference in how the body behaves. When reacting, the body is braced toward action or avoidance. When observing, even if tension remains, there is a subtle grounding. Breathing becomes slightly more available. The jaw loosens a fraction. Vision widens just enough to include more than the threat. These are small signals, but they indicate a shift in control. Another important distinction is how time is experienced. In reaction, everything feels urgent. There is a pressure to decide, respond, or escape. In observation, urgency softens, not because the situation is deemed harmless, but because the system is no longer convinced that immediacy equals survival. Time opens up, even briefly. This is why observation can feel uncomfortable at first. Reacting is familiar. It gives clear instructions. Observing removes that certainty. You are left with sensation without a script. The mind doesn't like this ambiguity, so it may try to pull you back into reaction by intensifying thoughts or emotions. This is not failure. It's the system testing whether awareness will stay present. When observation stabilizes, something interesting happens. You begin to notice not only the fear, but the urge to react to the fear, the impulse to distract yourself, to justify, to seek reassurance. Seeing that impulse without immediately following it creates a second layer of freedom. Not freedom from fear, but freedom in relation to it. Over time, this changes behavior in quiet ways. You may still feel anxious before speaking, but you speak anyway. You may still feel uncertainty, but you don't rush to eliminate it. Actions become less driven by the need to escape discomfort and more guided by what is actually needed in the moment. And yet, there is a deeper challenge hidden here. As observation grows, fear does not always fade. Sometimes it intensifies. This is where many people become confused and assume something has gone wrong. In reality, a different dynamic is emerging, one that reveals another subtle trap, the tendency to confuse fear with the self itself. And unless that confusion is seen clearly, observation can quietly collapse back into reaction without being noticed. Fear becomes truly dangerous, not when it appears, but when it is mistaken for who you are. This shift is subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It slips into language, into tone, into the way you silently describe your experience. Instead of "fear is here," the internal statement becomes "I am afraid," and then, almost without noticing, "this is just how I am." At that point, fear is no longer an event. It becomes an identity. When fear is identified with the self, it gains permanence. Temporary sensations begin to feel like fixed traits. A reaction that could pass in minutes is interpreted as evidence of limitation. "I'm not the kind of person who does this. I've always been like this. This is my nature." None of these statements describe fear. They describe a story built around it. The nervous system responds differently to a state than to an identity. A state can change. An identity must be defended. Once fear becomes part of who you believe you are, the system starts organizing around it. Choices are made to protect that identity. Risks are avoided not because they are dangerous, but because they threaten the image you have of yourself. This is why identification deepens fear over time. Every avoidance reinforces the belief. Every retreat confirms the story. And because the story feels personal, it becomes harder to question. Fear no longer needs to shout. It whispers through assumptions. Notice how identification compresses possibility. Instead of seeing a range of responses, you see a single outcome. "I can't handle this. This will overwhelm me." These are not predictions about the situation. They are declarations about the self. And once the self is defined as fragile, the world becomes full of threats. Another hidden cost of identifying with fear is the loss of curiosity. Observation requires openness. Identification closes the loop. If fear is who you are, there is nothing to observe, only something to endure or escape. Awareness collapses inward, and the reaction regains control, not through intensity but through familiarity. This is also where compassion often disappears. When fear is seen as the self, frustration turns inward. "Why am I like this?" The tone becomes harsh, impatient. But that harshness is just fear turning against itself. The system is still trying to protect, now by criticizing, controlling, or numbing. None of these strategies create freedom. They tighten the grip. There is a simple but destabilizing realization that begins to loosen this pattern. Fear is experienced, not embodied. It arises, moves, and changes like any other sensation. Even when it feels constant, it is actually renewing itself moment by moment. What makes it feel solid is not its presence, but the belief that it defines you. You can sense the difference directly. When fear is identified with, the question becomes, what is wrong with me? When fear is seen as an experience, the question shifts to, what is happening right now? The first collapses awareness into judgment. The second opens awareness into contact. This doesn't require rejecting the word "I." Language will still say, "I feel afraid." The danger is not in the words, but in the conclusion drawn from them. Feeling afraid does not mean being fear. It means fear is passing through a much larger field of experience that includes perception, memory, intention, and choice. At first, this distinction feels intellectual, but over time it becomes visceral. You notice that fear has texture, movement, fluctuation. Sometimes it spikes, sometimes it softens, sometimes it vanishes without explanation. If it were truly who you are, it wouldn't behave like this. It wouldn't come and go. As this becomes clearer, something unexpected happens. Fear may still appear, but it loses its authority to define the future. It no longer speaks as the voice of identity. It speaks as one signal among many. And when that happens, another challenge emerges. Without identifying with fear, the old strategies of avoidance begin to fail. You can no longer justify stepping back by saying, "This is just me." The system senses this loss of justification and reacts. Awareness increases, and with it, fear often intensifies. This is not a regression. It is the point where almost everyone is tempted to stop, misreading resistance as proof they've gone too far. There is a specific phase in this process that feels discouraging enough to make most people stop. It doesn't look dramatic from the outside. There is no collapse, no crisis, no obvious failure. What happens is quieter and more confusing. Awareness increases, and fear gets louder. Up until this point, you may have expected a linear improvement. Less identification, more observation, more space. And for a while that seems true. You notice fear without immediately reacting. You feel more present. You begin to understand the mechanics. Then, unexpectedly, the intensity returns. Thoughts become sharper. Sensations feel heavier. Old patterns resurface with surprising force. And the mind draws a quick conclusion. This isn't working. This is where almost everyone misreads the situation. When fear intensifies at this stage, it's not because awareness has failed. It's because awareness is threatening the system that fear has been maintaining. The nervous system is built to preserve continuity, not happiness, not growth, but predictability. When your way of relating to fear changes, predictability is disrupted. The system responds by increasing signal strength, hoping to restore the old order. This is why fear often escalates precisely when you stop identifying with it. Before, fear ran automatically. It didn't need to announce itself. Now it is being seen. And what is seen but not obeyed tends to protest. At this point, the mind looks for familiar explanations. I must be regressing. I was calmer before. Maybe I opened something I wasn't ready for. These interpretations feel logical, but they are part of the same defensive response. They attempt to re-establish certainty by reframing growth as danger. There is also a more subtle disappointment here. Many people expect awareness to feel empowering, even pleasant. When instead it feels raw, exposed, and demanding, they conclude something is wrong. But awareness is not a comfort strategy. It is a contact strategy. It brings you closer to experience, not away from it. What makes this stage so difficult is that the old escape routes no longer work as well. You can't fully distract yourself without noticing it. You can't fully identify with fear without sensing the contraction. You can't force positivity without feeling the mismatch. This creates a sense of being stuck in between, too aware to go back, not yet stable enough to feel free. This in-between state is often interpreted as failure when it is actually reorganization. The system is renegotiating control. Fear is testing whether it still has authority. It increases urgency, intensity, and narrative complexity to see if you will collapse back into reaction. If you do, the system relaxes. Predictability is restored. This is why giving up can feel like relief, not peace but familiarity. The body recognizes the old pattern and settles into it, even if it limits you. If you don't give up, something else begins to happen, but not immediately. First comes fatigue, a sense of, I don't know how to do this anymore. This is not weakness. It is the exhaustion of strategies that no longer apply. The old tools are gone. The new ones are not fully embodied yet. Here many people make the mistake of trying harder. More effort, more control, more techniques. But effort at this stage often increases tension because the system is not asking for force. It is asking for tolerance. Tolerance of not knowing. Tolerance of fear without resolution. Tolerance of being present without immediate payoff. This is the point where the question quietly shifts. It is no longer, how do I get rid of fear? It becomes, can I stay here without needing this to change right now? That question is destabilizing to the system that relies on urgency. Most people never stay long enough to find out what happens next. They interpret resistance as a warning rather than a signpost, but resistance is not random. It appears when something fundamental is being challenged. What is being challenged here is not fear itself, but the assumption that fear is trying to stop you. That assumption feels obvious, it feels protective, but it's incomplete. And unless it's examined, this stage will always feel like a dead end instead of a threshold. It feels natural to believe that fear exists to block you, that it shows up as an internal enemy standing between you and what you want to do. And for a long time, this interpretation seems accurate. Fear appears right before action, right before change, right before movement. So the conclusion feels obvious. Fear must be trying to stop you. But this is where the story becomes misleading. Fear is not oriented towards stopping. It is oriented towards stabilizing. Its priority is not your failure, but the preservation of what is known. From the perspective of the nervous system, known patterns equal safety, even when those patterns include discomfort, limitation, or quiet dissatisfaction. Predictability matters more than outcome. When you approach growth, the system does not evaluate whether that growth is good for you. It evaluates whether it is familiar. And unfamiliar territory, no matter how promising, registers as informational darkness. The brain cannot predict it accurately. That uncertainty triggers fear, not because something bad will happen, but because something unknown might. This is why fear often activates most strongly around expansion, not danger. You don't feel intense fear while repeating routines you already dislike. You feel it when you consider stepping outside them, new conversations, new roles, new ways of responding. Fear spikes not to stop you, but to pull you back into a zone where the system can predict consequences. Seen this way, fear is not a villain, it's a conservative force. It wants continuity. This explains something that otherwise makes no sense, why fear can persist even after you rationally know you are safe. Logic has updated, circumstances have changed, yet fear remains. That's because fear is not tracking facts, it's tracking familiarity, and familiarity lags behind understanding. When you interpret fear as opposition, you create an internal battle. You push forward. Fear pulls back, tension escalates, the system becomes polarized. But when you see fear as a request for predictability, the dynamic shifts. The question is no longer, how do I defeat this? It becomes, what is this system trying to preserve? Often it's preserving an identity, a self-image that has worked, even if imperfectly, a way of being that kept you oriented in the world. Growth threatens that orientation. It asks the system to operate without a map. Fear reacts not to the action itself, but to the loss of internal reference points. Notice how fear often sounds like concern. Are you sure? What if this goes wrong? What if you can't handle it? These are not commands to stop. They are attempts to slow down until predictability is restored. Fear is asking for reassurance, not surrender. The problem arises when reassurance is sought by retreating. When you step back into the familiar, fear quiets, the system relaxes, and this creates a powerful association. Avoidance equals relief. Over time, this trains fear to appear earlier and louder because it has learned that intensity restores control. But something changes when you stop framing fear as an obstacle. When fear is allowed to be present without being obeyed or fought, it begins to lose its leverage, not because it disappears, but because its strategy no longer works. It can no longer rely on urgency alone to maintain predictability. At this point, fear may escalate temporarily. It tries different angles, different stories, different sensations. This is not punishment, it's adaptation. The system is testing whether awareness will remain steady even without retreat. If you stay present, something subtle occurs. Fear is still there, but it no longer dictates direction. It becomes one signal among many. The system starts learning a new association. Unfamiliar does not equal unsafe. Movement can happen without catastrophe. This learning doesn't happen through reassurance or positive thinking. It happens through experience, through small actions taken while fear is present, not reckless actions but conscious ones. Each time you move without retreating, predictability expands. The unknown becomes slightly more known. Fear notices this, and gradually its role shifts. It stops trying to block movement and starts recalibrating thresholds. It still alerts, it still signals, but it no longer needs to dominate. This is the twist most people never reach. Fear was never trying to end your progress. It was trying to manage uncertainty. And once uncertainty is tolerated instead of avoided, fear no longer needs to sit in the driver's seat. This is where a different kind of leadership becomes possible, not control through force but direction through presence, not elimination of fear but reorganization of authority. And that reorganization marks the moment when something else quietly steps forward to lead. There is no dramatic takeover when consciousness takes the lead, no internal announcement, no sudden disappearance of fear. In fact, if you're waiting for a clear emotional victory, you'll likely miss it. This moment arrives quietly, almost anticlimactically, and that's precisely why it's real. What changes first is not how you feel, but how decisions are made. Fear may still be present. Sensations still move through the body. Thoughts still offer their familiar warnings. But they are no longer consulted as the final authority. They inform, but they do not command. Action begins to emerge from a different place, one that is less reactive and more inclusive. You notice this shift in ordinary moments. You do something without first checking whether fear approves. You speak even though your voice trembles. You pause before reacting, not to suppress the impulse, but because something in you is no longer rushed. The urgency that once dominated the inner landscape loses its grip. This is consciousness leading. It doesn't push fear away. It doesn't argue with it. It simply doesn't revolve around it. Fear becomes contextual rather than central, present, but no longer defining the situation. Internally, this feels like standing slightly behind the experience instead of being thrown forward by it. The body may still lean toward old habits, but awareness holds the whole scene. Sensation, thought, impulse, environment, all are included in a wider field, and within that field choice becomes possible, not as a mental effort, but as a natural consequence of space. One of the clearest signs of this shift is that the question changes. Instead of "how do I get rid of this feeling?" the question becomes "what is needed right now?" That question is not asked anxiously, it arises calmly, almost neutrally. And often the answer is simple, sometimes uncomfortable, but rarely dramatic. Another subtle indicator is how success and failure are perceived. When fear leads, outcomes define identity. If something goes well, there is relief. If it doesn't, there is collapse. When consciousness leads, outcomes become information. Useful, sometimes disappointing, but not self-defining. You learn without shrinking. This doesn't mean you become passive or detached. On the contrary, engagement increases. You are more available to what's actually happening, less consumed by internal negotiation. Energy that was once spent managing fear is freed for attention, listening, and responsiveness. Importantly, this state is not maintained by constant vigilance. You are not watching your thoughts all day. You are not policing your emotions. Consciousness leading feels lighter than that. It's marked by an underlying remembrance. Whatever appears is appearing within something larger. At first, this remembrance comes and goes. You lead for a moment, then fear pulls you back, then you notice and leadership returns. This oscillation is not a problem. It's how integration happens. Each return strengthens familiarity with the new orientation. Fear may test this new arrangement. It may grow louder at times, especially when stakes feel high. But its role has changed. It no longer signals stop. It signals pay attention, and attention no longer means paralysis. It means presence. From the outside, nothing may look different. Internally, the architecture has shifted. Fear has moved from the center to the periphery. Consciousness occupies the central position, not as a force, but as a space in which everything else occurs. This space does not need protection. It is not threatened by fear. It does not need fear to disappear in order to function. That is why it can lead. And yet, this leadership is fragile if misunderstood. Many people, once they taste it, try to hold on to it. They monitor themselves, trying to stay aware, trying not to fall back. Ironically, that effort reintroduces tension. Consciousness does not lead through effort. It leads through recognition. Recognition that you are the context, not the content. Recognition that thoughts and emotions move, but the space they move in does not. This is not a belief to maintain. It's a perspective to return to, again and again, especially in ordinary moments. The real challenge then is not accessing this state, but allowing it to stabilize without turning it into another project, without spiritual ambition, without constant self-checking. And that raises a quieter, more practical question: how this orientation can be sustained in daily life, not through discipline, but through something far more subtle and repeatable. Most people lose this state the moment they try to keep it. The instant awareness becomes something to maintain, protect, or perform. Effort creeps in. And effort quietly shifts leadership back to the mind, where tension lives. That's why sustaining this state has nothing to do with discipline, technique, or constant self-monitoring. It depends on something much simpler and much easier to miss. What stabilizes consciousness is not doing more, but remembering differently. When consciousness takes the lead, it doesn't do so by control. It leads by context. It is the space in which fear, thought, sensation, and action appear. The problem is not that this space disappears. It doesn't. The problem is that attention forgets it and collapses back into content. Sustaining the state is really about how often and how gently you remember where you are positioned. This remembering cannot be forced. The moment you try to be aware, you create distance and tension. But there is another kind of remembering that is almost passive. It feels less like an action and more like a soft reorientation, like realizing you've been holding your breath and allowing it to release without instruction. You might notice this when you pause, not to fix anything but to sense the environment, the weight of your body, the presence of sound, the fact that thoughts are already happening without your permission. In that noticing, there is no effort to change experience. There is only recognition that experience is happening within something larger. That recognition is enough. The mistake many people make is turning awareness into a project. They check themselves constantly. Am I present? Am I identified? Am I conscious right now? Those questions subtly reinforce the idea that consciousness is fragile and must be maintained through vigilance. But vigilance is a form of tension, and tension feeds the very reactivity you're stepping out of. Instead, this state is sustained through familiarity. The more often you recognize yourself as the space in which experience occurs, the less effort that recognition requires. It becomes the default orientation, not because you enforce it, but because it makes more sense than the alternative. Daily life offers countless entry points for this remembering, not special moments, ordinary ones, waiting, walking, listening to someone speak without rehearsing your response. Feeling a reaction begin and noticing that you are already aware of it. These moments don't require spiritual framing. They require honesty. And honesty here means not pretending fear is gone. Fear will still appear, some days more strongly than others. Sustaining this state does not mean remaining calm. It means remaining inclusive. Fear is allowed in the space. So are doubt, irritation, and uncertainty. When nothing is excluded, nothing needs to fight for control. Another quiet stabilizer is letting attention rest more in sensation than in narrative. Thoughts tend to pull identity toward the future or the past. Sensation anchors awareness in immediacy. Feeling the body, even briefly, reminds the system that experience is happening now, not only as interpretation, but as contact. This doesn't mean scanning or analyzing the body. It's more like letting sensation be obvious. Pressure, warmth, movement. When sensation is allowed without commentary, awareness naturally widens, and in that widening, effort drops away. Over time, something important happens. You stop trying to hold the state, and the state begins to hold you. Not permanently, not flawlessly, but reliably enough that losing it no longer feels like failure. You fall out, you notice, you return. No drama, no self-criticism, just reorientation. This is why sustaining consciousness is not about length, but frequency. Not about staying aware all day, but about returning many times without resistance. Each return weakens the old reflex to identify. Each return strengthens trust in this orientation. And slowly, the system learns something profound. It doesn't need to tense in order to function. Life can be met without bracing against it. Fear can be present without dictating movement. Awareness doesn't need to be summoned. It's already here, waiting to be acknowledged. At this point, freedom stops feeling like a special state and starts feeling like a background condition. Not dramatic, not euphoric, just spacious enough to live from. And from that space, the final realization begins to surface. Not as an insight to analyze, but as a lived understanding about what this was never really about. This was never about eliminating fear or turning yourself into someone who no longer feels it. Fear was never the enemy. The problem was allowing it to sit at the center of your life. When fear leads, everything contracts. When consciousness leads, life expands, even with fear still present. Freedom doesn't arrive when fear disappears. It arrives when fear stops being the reference point for your decisions. And once that shift happens, it doesn't need to be dramatic to be permanent. You don't become fearless. You become free enough to move without waiting for fear to approve your life. If you stayed until the end, write this sentence in the comments. I am here even with fear. It lets me know you reached this moment with me. And if this content resonated and you want more explorations like this, choose one of the videos appearing on your screen now and keep going.